Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome all of you who are watching the live stream and all of you who watch us later on YouTube. This is one of over 700 programs that the Commonwealth Club has put together after the pandemic began, almost 2 years ago now. And we bring to you live streaming and sometimes without an audience altogether, the authors and the topics in politics and foreign affairs that we brought to you for the last 119 years. We just celebrated our 119th birthday. So, welcome. And tonight we have a great topic, something that's always been interesting in America, and it's important to see what the history of it is, because every time we have a big problem with this topic, people forget that we've gone through this about a dozen times before. So we have Nancy Foner with us today. Her book is called One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club, Nancy.
Thank you.
So you're going to your book focuses, anyway, we'll cover some other stuff from before, but your book focuses on post-1965, the immigration law there. So why don't you tell us what happened in 1965 that changed the game?
It really changed the game. Yeah. I mean, in 1965, there was legislation that was passed in Congress that abolished the national origins quotas that had shaped immigration since 1924. The national origins quotas went into effect in 1924 as a way to eliminate immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, which was enormous between 1880 and 1920. Already before that bill had been passed in 1924, there had been bars on Asian immigration. So that for dozens of years, more than decades, the U.S. had experienced very low immigration, so that by 1970, which is right after the 65 law was passed, less than 5% of the nation were foreign born and under 10 million. Mm-hmm. The 1965 law changed the way immigrants, whether they could come and who could come. It changed that now there was no different countries did not have specific quotas. There was an overall number limiting immigration to the United States and from various parts of the world, but not by country. And now family reunification became the main basis for getting a legal permanent residence and to some extent employment. And as soon as the law went into effect, which by the way, the Congress did not know, they didn't think that this was going to happen. They thought actually it was going to lead to more European immigration, mm-hmm. because there had been restrictions on Southern and Eastern and Central European immigration, but that was not what happened. There was not much desire from Europe to come to the U.S. And instead what it did was it led to huge increases in immigration from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from Asia. And later on, there were further expansion of immigration from Africa as well. And so it changed where immigrants were coming from, and it changed the numbers. Mm-hmm. And so that whereas I said that in 1960, there were 70, there were 5 million immigrants in the United States. Today, there are 45 million immigrants in the United States. And whereas in 1970, less than 5% of the population was foreign born, today it's 14% foreign born. Mm-hmm. And if you add on the children of immigrants, the US born children of immigrants, it's 26%. And that's 1/4 of the nation. It's a little more than 1/4 of the nation. And so the law had, and not just, it was a 65 law and then subsequent congressional legislation actually expanded the number of immigrants coming in. And here I'm talking about lawful permanent residents, those who are coming, who have the ability to live and work here.
Yeah. So part of this number, the 1/4, does it include the illegal immigrants, or does it not?
Yes.
It does, yeah.
It does. It does. Because the 1/4 figure, when I tell you that there are 45 million immigrants, that's a census, from the census data.
Right.
And that includes, it doesn't ask if you're undocumented or documented. It's based on where you say you're born. And so out of that 45 million, about 10 or 11 million are actually undocumented. Those are the estimates that most social scientists accept or put forward. So about 1/4 of the immigrants who live in the United States are undocumented, which is actually a very high proportion.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about that later. It's also that many of those, actually a very high percentage, about 2/3 or more, have been living here 10 years or more. So they're actually, on the whole, a quite settled population.
Yeah, I think before we go more deeply into this, to make sure our audience knows where we're going, your story, although that's a totally different totally different outcome from what was expected by the Congress in '65. They thought they were going to get one thing, they got something else altogether. But the story of immigration and how it influences it hardly changes at all depending upon where the people come from. That the same outcome of immigration on our economy seems to be the same benefits. There are some different disadvantages and stuff like that, but the same benefits don't seem to be that strong based upon where the people come from.
No, I think that I don't actually look at it quite that way in the book, but yes, the benefits of immigration have been, or the changes that immigration has brought, and the benefits it has brought have been similar throughout American history. So yes, although it's obviously not exactly the same. Things do not repeat themselves exactly the same way. No. Obviously. And for example, we could talk about undocumented immigration, which in the past we didn't have. If you looked, the frequent comparison is to 100 years ago or more, when we had this massive immigration from Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe between 1880 and the 1920s. And then there were very few undocumented immigrants because there were no numerical limitations on immigration, and there were no visas that you had to get before you came here. So that's one way, by the way, that it's different.
Right. Why would people sneak in when they can just walk in? Right.
Yeah, or take the boat in. Yeah. The big thing was getting on the boat, actually, not getting into. Once you were on the boat, you were good.
So we had a lull from 1924 to 1970 or so, where immigration was not. But in the 50s, when everyone was so, did that contribute at all to the idea in the 50s, which is smack dab in the middle of that America was stable and it was a certain kind of thing, and that it shouldn't change? That's what America is. Or is that just based on the fact that the people who were writing in 2000 were all born in the 50s, and so everybody?
I think there are a lot of different reasons, but yes, I think the fact that there was low immigration, partly because of the restrictive legislation, partly because there was a Great Depression, partly because there was World War II, that there hadn't been new recruits coming in, and so the people, yes, and there were the second generation, the children of immigrants were growing up, and they were coming. And the post-World War II period was also a very prosperous period in American history. And so the children of immigrants were able to advance and move up, and they were assimilating and becoming American. And so, yes, I think that's a big change. Then all of a sudden, by this, the big movement begins in the late 60s, but people don't begin to really see it, until later. But by the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, there's large numbers of immigrants who are living in this country, and they're coming from different places. They're not Europeans. They're coming mostly from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia.
One of the things that concerns some people is the different religions that the immigrants have. And you talk about how now there are mosques and there are Hindu temples and so on, a small number. But people who've studied it, of course, know. But this is very much like when the Catholics first started coming. And so why don't you talk about that? Because they're treated pretty much the same way, and their churches were treated pretty much the same way. But that didn't stop anything, right?
Well, yeah, sure. If you look back, I think that's one of the myths. People will say, well, in the past, immigrants. Well, one thing we can talk about there's racial ideas that they were white, and also that yes, that they were accepted. They compared to immigrants today. I don't think the focus actually is so much on their religions coming today, because actually most immigrants who come today are Christian. About 70%, 75%. There are Muslim and Hindu and other religions people come, but they're a very small percentage of immigrants today, actually. What I think people forget is the prejudice and discrimination and difficulties that European immigrants had in the past. Yes, and part of it was religion. There was vicious anti-Catholicism in this country. There was a political movement in the mid-1800s to deny them the right to vote, to keep them from public office. Very vicious anti-Catholicism, and that did not let up for a long time. I mean, the big thing was, even when John F. Kennedy ran for president, the notion was, he was going to take order from the Pope. So there was a lot of anti-Catholicism and, of course, a lot of anti-Semitism. Large numbers of Jews came in the 1880 to 1920 period, and very vicious. The also anti-Italian, which was not just a matter of their Catholic religion. It was a lot had to do with that, but also both Jews and Italians were thought of as racially inferior. They were legally white, but they were seen as inferior whites. They were seen that they were polluting America, that they would ruin this country, that they would never assimilate. And we really, I think people forget that. And in fact, there was movements to try to restrict their entry, which ultimately were successful in 1924. Right. So, there has been anti-immigrant sentiment before, and it's taken the form of being intolerant or hostile to their religions, and also notions of race. There were different. Race was not a color-coded word as much as it is today. In the past, you could be white, but you could be an inferior white. And there were notions also of Italians were often referred to as swarthy, and they were the largest immigrant group at the turn of the 20th century. They were seen by many as not really truly white. Jews were seen to look different. There was one study that was done in New York of Jewish noses to show that Jews, actually it was shown to disprove that Jews didn't have a particular nose. Right. But I mean, the fact that anybody was doing a study like that is kind of incredible. So that there was a lot of, and in fact, one of the questions that we ask in the social sciences is, well, how did it happen that Jews and Italians and the Irish, and how did they become part of equal members of a white community, and how did the country go from not being, a Protestant nation, to one that sees itself now as Protestant, Catholic, and Jew? And I think, that's a change that happened in the past. And the question that's asked now is, well, what's going to happen in the future? And immigrants, of course, coming in today, many of them are seen as non-white. They are Hispanic, they are Asian Americans, and there's a growing number of Black immigrants who are coming. 1 out of 10 immigrants today is Black, from either mostly from Africa or the Caribbean. So there have been, and we can talk about, how are immigrants changing notions of race? Are they changing notions of race in America? And what can we predict or think about possibilities for the future?
One of the statistics you had struck me, you just mentioned it, that 10% of the immigrants are now Black. And you said, I think in the 1960s, if I remember, it was only 1% had been foreign born. Is that an indication that we have at least made some progress in dealing racially with African Americans in our country? I know we haven't made enough progress. But
we haven't made enough
attracting
progress,
people now. Yeah.
Well, I think that we had a civil rights movement. I mean, right. It hasn't done. There are still lots and lots of problems, but things have changed since the 1950s in terms of the position of African Americans and certainly in America, American society. I'm not sure how well. I think there was a large West Indian migration to the United States, mostly to the New York area in the 1920s. But certainly, Black immigrants did not go to the American South before the 1950s because it was segregated. There was legal segregation. They would never have gone there. And of course, they also had problems getting admitted because the laws that I talked about that changed in 1965 did not allow large-scale West Indian or African immigration. And so they weren't coming then. So partly it's a question of the law, partly it's a question of a changing racial scene in the United States. But I think what's relevant in terms of the transformation, I mean, and the question that we can ask is, what does it make a difference that 10% of Black people in America are foreign born? And if we look at their children, about 20%, if we can, are either immigrants or children of immigrants. So, that's a question that I do grapple with in the book, to what extent that's made any changes in perceptions of Blackness or the way people, views of Black people.
Well, before we leave the past altogether and stick to post-1965, America, as I always say, is a land of immigrants. I mean, obviously, the Europeans that first came here thought it was a land for the taking, which they took it. But other than the Native Americans, everybody was an immigrant. And they were all different groups, and they all didn't like the other groups getting a piece of the action either. So this part of American culture has been going on since its start, since the colonial era. The other part that's interesting to me about the whole immigration issue is it's a little bit of a self-selecting group, at least most of the time. It's people who are ambitious enough or energetic enough to break the entropy that most people have. You mentioned that at a certain point after the 1965 Act, not many Europeans wanted to come to America. And if you go back to the colonial times, who came? The third and fourth sons of people who weren't going to get ahead back home, basically. So why don't you talk about that whole overall arching thing that
Well, on the whole, immigrants, we know from studies today that immigrants are a selected group.
Yeah.
I mean, they are more educated, they're more ambitious than those who stay behind on the whole. And so we're getting, in fact, it's wonderful for America, isn't it? I mean, we get these people coming who are ambitious, who often have high levels of education. I think people are maybe surprised to know that about a third of the foreign born in the U.S. have a college degree or more. So that's quite high. I mean, in that sense, we've never had such a highly educated immigrant population. So, and in fact, the experience for many of the immigrants who come who have high levels of education is they often can't get jobs commensurate with their degrees because they lack English, because they can't satisfy certain licensing requirements. And so I guess from the U.S. point of view, we benefit by having people who are highly educated doing jobs that don't even demand, taking care of children or taking care of the elderly. You get high-level people who have high levels of education. Many of them have high levels of education, and also they're very ambitious and want to get ahead. And I think they also have very strong aspirations for their children. After all, it's very hard to move here. You move yourself from one country to another. You leave behind, your friends, your relatives, the place that you know. When my first research was on Jamaicans, and I did work in a Jamaican village, and the people there would tell me, Jamaica is a beautiful place, but we can't make it here. We have to leave. And they come and they are, and I see this from my students that I teach in New York City, their parents are really motivated for their children to do well. They make tremendous sacrifices for their children. And so I think, this is a benefit for America. And this is, I think, always been true. That this strong motivation to do well and getting the most ambitious. And I should say, by the way, people who are probably healthier than those who stay behind.
Those are averages. There's always exceptions to that. Of course. That's just important to say. It's not 100%. But
no,
the averages are very high.
There are low-educated immigrants too today.
And you mentioned in your book the number of doctors in the United States. that were foreign born is what? I don't remember what it was, a quarter or a third.
28% of
28%.
physicians and surgeons in the U.S. are foreign born.
Right. And
That's a very high figure.
And even more in software engineers or something, right?
Yeah, it's higher. Yeah.
Yeah. So that always shifts the perception of immigration when people realize that. So let's go back to 1965. So why don't you say a little bit more about, first that we'd had 40 some years, just a little over 40 years of restrictive policies. Now, we're not going to say that caused the Depression, but we had 40 years of restrictive policies. And what did the Congress, this was right at the time that we had the Civil Rights Act and we had other Great Society programs. So another part of the Great Society program was this immigration issue. But what were they thinking? It's always, what was their hope from the bill? You said a little bit about it, but I think it's really kind of interesting to say, this is what they were hoping that bill would do.
Well, I don't know what they were sensitive to. It was part of civil rights legislation. That was part of it, right, to open up the U.S. again because it had been so closed. And certain groups had been kept out. Asians, for example, really could hardly immigrate here. And as I said, I think that they thought it was going to lead to more European immigration. They really didn't see it as opening the door to the world, which is what it did. So I'm not really sure what they all had on them. And there were foreign policy pressures, to make America look better, in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you think that the Vietnam War and the Cold War issues with the Soviet Union had an influence on an attempt to try to make the United States look more like its ideals?
Well, maybe, yeah. Although the Vietnam War was later. It started then. But we let in a lot of refugees from Vietnam. That was in the 70s. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things about the immigration that I found interesting too is how similarly it played out in different locations. I know that I grew up in the Midwest in a town called Kenosha, Wisconsin, and it was about half Lutheran and half Catholic, and it was an immigrant town, mostly in the 1850s to 1880s, and now it's 70 years later. There were a lot of Italian families, and some of them had their capital from their grandfathers having worked with Al Capone in Chicago, that kind of thing. So there were a lot of different mixes of everything. But there were certain Catholic parishes, and they were split up by nationalities almost. They had a certain name, like the Holy Rosary, that was where the Italians went, different names. In 85, I went to New York to work, and I lived in Jersey City for a couple of years. And they had all the same immigrant population from the same period of time. The churches had all been built at the same time. They'd all been named the same thing. There was the same Kashmirs for the Polish, et cetera, et cetera. So I found it interesting how that had replicated in city after city. It must have all across the country at such a rapid rate. And you mentioned that period of time from 1880 to 1920, when this was all happening at its height, that was a big part of our industrial boom. That America's economy took off like crazy during that time. So.
Well, you've got two issues. I'm not correct. Right. One is ethnic neighborhoods, right?
Right.
That immigrants, when they come, often settle in communities with people from their home country. That's understandable. They have friends and relatives there, people who can help them, right? People speak the same language. There are the foods that are available. They can avoid experiencing prejudice and discrimination. So many immigrants, when they come, whether it was in the past or the present, end up staying in ethnic neighborhoods. But the neighborhoods sometimes are different. In the previous eras, and they often went to terrible, slum neighborhoods. Like the Lower East Side is the classic one in the literature, right? But today, many immigrants are going to neighborhoods that were middle or lower middle class, where whites have left often, and there's housing available. There are actually more immigrants living in the suburbs now than in central cities. So that's also a difference. And they're also moving to places that haven't had immigration for a long time, or in some cases, almost never. The South, well, I guess we could say they were forced immigrants, right? They were enslaved people in the South. but they didn't have a need for immigrants because they had a population already doing the work. And today there's been a big migration of immigrants into the South. So that's something new. So they're going to new places. And they are, although immigrants often start out living in ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic communities, they may move out later and their children may move out later. The other issue, I don't know, you raised the issues of the economy, that immigrants were very key and played a major role in the industrialization of America. They provide the workers in the factories and were crucial for the industrialization of America. But today they're also playing a crucial economic role. I mean, we're in a period of deindustrialization, so they're not going to the factories that much, although I guess they're one factor in keeping the garment, to the extent to which the garment industry still is in America. They are actually a very high percentage of the workers, but they're in many service industries. They're, they're picking crops, which they've always done, right? They're in agriculture. They're in a large range of service jobs in restaurants and hotels, caring for the elderly, caring for sick people, working in caring for children. I mean, there's a whole range of jobs that they're in service jobs in this economy. And of course, I guess they practically, I sort of say, I think they practically invented Silicon Valley. They're heavily involved in the high tech. I mean, I think the figures on that are actually quite amazing. The founders, there was a study in 2018 of the startup companies that were valued at $1 billion or more than half had an immigrant as a founder, at least one founder. And in these companies, 80% of the high managerial and product development roles were immigrants. I mean, you're in California, so you know this.
Right.
So they're heavily, they've been very important, not just in working in high tech, but in innovating and in founding companies. And, that's a very key part of the American economy. So they have been very important. What is it? 1 out of 4 new businesses small businesses are founded by immigrants. They're 1/5 of small business owners. They've invented various kinds of services like nail salons, which Asian American supermarkets, the Chinatown buses. I mean, so they've invented new kinds of businesses. Although in meatpacking, they're the major source of workers as meatpacking has gone to the Midwest and the South. They're the main source of workers in the meatpacking industry. So I think they're very critical to the economy. They've helped it grow. I think the other aspect of the economy, and this is true, I guess, in the past as well as in the present, is that immigrants are not only workers, they consume goods and services. So without immigrants, our economy would be hurting. I mean, I think of, say, schools. I'm in New York City, and the schools are terribly overcrowded. And one reason they are terribly overcrowded is because we have over 3 million immigrants, and they have a lot of children. And so the schools are crowded. But without immigrants, the schools would be closing. And there would be fewer jobs for teachers, for custodians, for people who work in the kitchens. I mean, and you can do almost any industry, service industry, even the food they buy, the clothes they buy, that stimulates the economy. So that's a really important, thing that people forget. I think that without immigrants, our economy they really benefit the economy in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that people worry about immigrants coming in and taking low-cost jobs away from Native Americans, but that the statistics show that doesn't. First of all, it doesn't happen as often as people think it does. Second, I think it might affect teenage jobs, which everybody used to have teenage jobs, and that seems to have disappeared. Nobody's a paper boy anymore. People go around in cars and throw them out the window, that kind of thing. But that overall, more jobs are created than those few jobs that are lost because of what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic that economists look at all the time. Is immigration hurting native-born workers? And the consensus in study after study in this one National Academy of Sciences report is that overall the answer is very little, because they create jobs through their founding businesses, because they consume goods and services, among other things. They overall, if you look at overall the picture, I mean, there may be some areas where immigrants are competing. For example, they mentioned one possibly is a construction. There may be competition for lower level jobs, but then it's creating more jobs, for supervisors or for real estate agents, so you have to really look at the whole balance. You can't just look at one level or one type of job. You have to look at the whole economy. And when you look at the whole economy, immigrants are not, on the whole, not hurting the employment of native workers or their wages. And what we find is that native workers shun the kinds of jobs that immigrants are taking, actually, and they move into jobs that often demand, for example, more communication skills. And so I think that's the consensus among economists, that they're not, even though we hear politicians sometimes say they're taking our jobs with Trump, they're killing us. They're not killing us. They're helping us, because without immigration, without these 45 million immigrants, the economy would be worse off.
Yeah. It's another old topic that goes back to the 60s, when people started realizing how big the baby boom was and how many people that was, and what a problem that would be for Social Security and everything in the future. And we know China has a big problem and Japan has a big problem. But our problem hasn't quite happened as much as we thought, for this reason, right?
Except it may, because the baby boom by, 1930, I mean 2030, you see, I'm a century ago. 2030, all the baby boomers will be 65 and older. So this large cohort of people, it's a very big cohort, are going to be leaving the workforce. And at the same time, fertility is way down. It's been dropping in the United States. It's now quite a bit below replacement level. And so the question is, who's going to do some of these jobs at all levels? And much as there is some among a significant segment of the population doesn't want more immigration and fears immigration for certain reasons, the fact is, what are we going to do without immigrants? There's going to be a demand for immigration. And the question is how that will work out. Will it be allowing in permanent legal residents who can live here and work here, and not have to leave? Will it mean more temporary workers? I mean, who's going to care for the elderly? That's the other thing. We're going to have a large baby boom generation growing old. That's just 65. But as people grow older, they need care, and all they have chronic diseases or chronic conditions and need care. Who is going to care for them? Who's going to, we know that, we know that there's going to be a demand for nurses. There's going to be a demand for nursing aides. There's going to be a demand for workers, people in private homes caring for the elderly. And who's going to do that, among other things, right? And so that is an issue for the future.
Yeah. So the problem is still there, but
yes,
not quite. But I think one of your statistics struck me that in maybe, I don't remember when, maybe 2015, around there, that there were 6.1 million people over 85 years old. But that another 10 years from now, in 2030, when the baby boom is all retired, that there'll be 14 million people. So 2.5 times what there is now. And it's exactly that problem that you're talking about. That's a really big increase. But let's talk about some of the fun things. I was thinking when you were talking about the Italians and that they weren't accepted, and I thought, well, Frank Sinatra probably helped, undo some of that. And so you talk a lot about the cultural additions that are made by immigrants. And so why don't you talk about some of those influences that are going on? It's not just in entertainment, but in food.
Yes, food. I love, food. Yes, of course, immigrants have always helped us with food, right in there, right? Italians brought us pizza, right? Jews brought us the bagels. I mean, they've become iconic. Immigrants have always brought us and diversified our diet and brought us delicious foods. And that's happening today. Salsa outsells ketchup. Tacos have become standard fare. I like the figure that there are more Chinese restaurants in the U.S. than McDonald's, Burger Kings, and Kentucky Fried Chickens combined. And it's not just that there are Chinese restaurants everywhere, which there are because they've spread out. They're not just in China, the way they in the past they were in these rather small Chinatowns, but Chinese restaurants are throughout America. But also their new cuisine, it's not just Cantonese, it's from other parts, regional dishes in China. So they have certainly varied our diets, whether it's eating at a fast food restaurant, whether it's going to a fancy restaurant or going to the supermarket. Our diets have been very much, or our cuisines have been very much changed by immigration. And they've changed, they have an effect, and I think changed the films we watch, the novels we read. I mean, you only have to look at the New York Times. I don't know if you read the New York Times book review, and you see almost every week there is a new novel or memoir by a recent immigrant or second generation author. They are winning prizes like Junot Diaz for The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, or Jhumpa Lahiri for The Namesake. So they're and dealing with themes. After all, there were famous writers in the past and novelists who were immigrants in days gone by, but they're and they deal in many of the same themes, but also themes that are relevant today, such as undocumented status, or in the case of I looked at films too. They've been changing The Namesake. I don't know how many people who are listening saw The Namesake, sorry. The Big Sick is what I meant, which is a film written and starred in by a Pakistani-born immigrant about not arranged marriage, but semi-arranged marriage. It's a very good film. Or, television programs featuring and about immigrants. Music, they've had a big influence on music, bringing Latin rhythms and melding them with American styles. Gloria Estefan is an example, Miami-based and Cuban-born. People think that hip hop was an African-American invention, but actually it was a mixture of Caribbean and African American, and developed in New York. And some of the biggest stars in rap are immigrants. Rihanna is one of them. So I think there was all kinds of ways that immigrants are changing and enriching our culture. The festivals that Cinco de Mayo has become a kind of regular festival in many parts of the country. In New York City, the West Indian American Day Parade. Some people say it attracts 2 million people. I'm not quite sure, but it is the largest ethnic festival in New York now. It required attendance by politicians. It happens on Labor Day. So I think there are all kinds of ways that immigrants have been enriching and changing American culture and creating new mixtures in the United States, because it's not just that they bring their homeland culture and that stays intact here. There's an Americanizing process, one could call it, but a mixture of immigrant cultures and homeland cultures and American influences that take place in the United States, which happened in the past and is happening again today.
Yeah, St. Nicholas became Santa Claus over time, right?
Right. Yeah. And we eat frankfurters, right, and hot dogs and Christmas. Yes, exactly. So, I think immigrants one thing I did want to, I hope that comes out in the book is how much America, the U.S. in the past was changed by immigrants, right? And there's this constant process of change. And so the U.S. that these post-65 immigrants came to was an America that had already been changed by many waves of immigration, and they now are adding their own mixtures and their own impact and influence on this country.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book that a lot of people, when they study immigration, they talk about how immigration is affecting America, but you're talking more about how the immigrants are having an influence on the American culture rather than how we deal with it. Why don't you explain your slightly different angle on that?
Well, I think a lot of the studies, understandably, are of how immigrants are changed and how they adapt to this country. And that's obviously a very important topic. And I myself have done work on that. But not that many social scientists or scholars look at the other side of the picture, how immigrants are changing this country. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to take a more systematic approach to that and not just look at one aspect, not just the politics, not just issues of race, not just the economy, but to look at a number of domains in depth and to show how much this post-65 immigration, which we are still in the middle of, so it makes it hard, is having an impact in changing American society. I think we tend to take it for granted and not really be aware of it so much. I think it's, but it is having a big impact on American society, and I think it's important for us to understand why. I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about, I don't know if you're going to ask about it, but we can, is the issue of race.
Right. Go ahead. Go right ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, because immigration has changed the racial composition of the population in a very major way, and I think we should say that. If we look back to 1960, 85% of Americans were white. Today, the figure is about 60%. In 1960, Asians were practically invisible at less than 1%. They're now 6%. In 1960, Hispanics were 3.5% of the country. They're now 19%. They are the largest minority group. And to a large extent, it is because of immigration. I mean, there's births to immigrants, but it's immigration has led to this very great change in the racial composition of the population. And that's evident if we look at particular cities. I mean, in Los Angeles, for example, to give a California example, in 1970, immigrants, and this is the city of Los Angeles, not the whole metro area, but in the city, about 10% of the city, it was 1960, were Hispanic, and now it's about half. And we can look at, cities throughout the country, and it's not just that the population of Asians and Hispanics and Black immigrants has grown, but also diversified, because it's no longer, when I study, I did a lot of studies of New York, immigration, Asian does not just mean Chinese in New York anymore. It means Korean and Filipino and increasingly Pakistanis and Indians and Bangladeshis. I mean, there are large numbers from all these groups. In New York, Hispanic, we didn't even use that word, was Puerto Rican, and now Dominicans are a larger group. There's a large population of Mexicans, Central Americans. So there's also been a change in ethnicity and ethnic groups within these populations. So I think that and the Hispanic populations have grown too. So I think in cities throughout, and certainly California is an example of this, right? Yeah. So I think it's really changed the racial composition of the population, but it's also changed perceptions of race. And I think, for example, East Asians used to be seen as a yellow peril. I mean, that was the common a common way of seeing them, right? A common popular view. And today, a common popular view is that they're a model minority. And partly that has to do with the nature of Asian immigration. Partly there are a number of factors involved, but partly it has to do with the fact certainly among East Asian groups, are a hyper-selected group. Very high percentages of them are college educated, and their children are doing extraordinarily well and entering elite institutions at very high numbers. So there's been a change. The very category Hispanic is really a new invention. It became an enumeration category on the census in 1980.
I want to emphasize that, because I found it fascinating that you said, well, they put a new category in the census, and pretty soon things changed. So why don't you explain? Because that's a lot of power given to a census category.
The census doesn't determine the way we think about race, but it has a big impact. Yes, they wanted to count this group, and they created this Hispanic category, which then took on a reality, right? Of people from Latin America and the Hispanic Caribbean often think of themselves in terms of their country of origin, but the term Hispanic has taken on a reality, or Latino, and now the new term Latinx. So these are terms and ways of perceiving groups that have changed. Black immigrants, I think I think they're especially in areas in cities and metro areas where Black immigrants are very dominant and very numerous, and a large proportion of the Black population. And that's really New York primarily, and the New York metro area and Miami. There's a greater sensitivity to ethnic differences within the Black population, as well as in cities where Africans are the main drivers of increases in the Black population. Say a place like Lewiston, Maine, or Minneapolis, which has seen very large numbers of Africans coming. And whites also it's affected how white people see themselves as well. I think that in this country where now, about a third of the country are what we would call racial minorities. I mean, that's a big change from the black and white notion that was so predominant prior to 1960, that they're more aware of themselves as a racial group, and a significant proportion, some surveys say about a fifth, feel threatened by the decline in the white population, the fact that non-whites are growing and having increased economic and political power, and that they're not as privileged, and a resentment of immigrants, and a feeling that whites are under threat, right? That that immigrants are unjustly cutting in line is the phrase, right? So I think that immigration has not only changed the composition of the population in terms of race, but also perceptions. And I mean, one question, and I don't really have an answer to this, but I think about it is well, how is this going to? What will happen in the future? After all, what will happen in the future in terms of as the children of these immigrants grow up, a third generation arises, and we have continued immigration, which we will to some extent. How is this going to affect notions and perceptions of race? One of the things that's been happening, and that's quite pronounced, is the growing rate of mixed unions. In 2015, 1 out of 6 new marriages involved a person of different race or ethnicity, and mostly it was a white person with a non-white person, with a minority. In 2017, 1 out of 10 infants was born to a white parent and a minority parent. So we're going to have also in the United States increasing numbers of people who will be of mixed race. Now, will we think of them as mixed race? I mean, that's an issue. Will they have the ability to move between racial categories? Will some of them sometimes claim whiteness or not claim whiteness? Or how will they be seen by others? It's because whatever you claim, that's how other people also see you. Will a new category, even like a mestizo category, become part of our conversations? Will we think that way? How will, there are all kinds of questions for the future, and a lot of this does have to do with immigration. We can't assume, and then this goes back to history, if you were in New York City in 1910 and you were a Jewish or Italian immigrant, you would say that it was impossible. It was impossible that Jews and Italians would ever be seen the same way as Northern and Western Europeans, ever. That they would never be seen that way. There would be prejudice against them, and they would never be fully accepted. But here we are in 2022, and well, there still may be some prejudice against Jews and Italians. They are seen as fully white. So we don't know. The question, that's why you have to think that these notions of race are flexible and change, and immigration has a role. So that's something I also discuss in the book, because I think it's...
Do you ever wonder whether with the pressure on whites as a race now to see themselves as a race, that will influence their perception of people who feel that because of their race they're in trouble, because sometimes it's like, embarrassing to be white, right? And I know people have traveled in the past. I mean, I lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years in the 70s, and the percentage of the population that was not Cantonese Chinese was way under 1%. And there were plenty of experiences of that you're the outsider. But that was on the basis of not being financially at the bottom of the rung either. So it's different. But you would think that this kind of experience, at the very least, will make people see what's going on in the other people's, why other people are complaining about this issue.
Well, perhaps. We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of, there are particularly those who are attracted to the Republican Party these days, right? Which plays on these anti-immigrant fears and feelings of resentment, towards immigrants, and a fear that America is, no longer the way it was, and that whites are losing their privileges. And the fact is, though, that whites are, as a group, are still relatively privileged and powerful in American society, and so that we haven't had a complete change yet. So I don't know how that will work. And of course, it's not just a matter of numbers, right? It's a question of power and influence and prestige and wealth. But we'll see what happens, right? I think an issue is, will race matter less in interactions? Will people feel more comfortable in interactions with others? I mean, another statistic, because I do talk in the book about changes in neighborhoods, and one of the interesting changes is the decline of all white neighborhoods. There was a study done in 2000, and it looked at metropolitan areas that were very diverse, and it found that of the neighborhoods, where there were 1,200 neighborhoods that were all white in the year 1980, and by 2000, only a quarter of them were all white. And so, you can say, and it's not just that there were one or two people who were not white in those communities. There were substantial numbers of Asians and Hispanics in many of those communities. So another issue, of course, is, as we know that there are growing numbers, particularly of Asians and Hispanics, in many living together or in communities with whites, how is that going to affect relations among them? The group that seems to be most, what we know, it doesn't seem to be, that is the most segregated from whites are black people. They have the most trouble, in finding integrated neighborhoods. And of course, that has to do with our history of slavery and legal segregation. And that the other groups did not experience. That's a worrisome prospect, whether their experiences will be different and worse. But, the question is, as people mix and mingle in neighborhoods and churches and temples and in colleges, particularly in universities and schools, at work, will race become less important, right, in how people feel about others? And again, with the rise of more people who have mixed races is also a very interesting, and have not only mixed races, people who are of a mixed race, but families that mix, of people in their families that have different racial backgrounds, right, because of mixed unions, and how that will operate. I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this, because we don't really know how it's going to work out. Right. But I think this is, looking ahead, an issue. Not an issue, but something we need to study, and we'll wait and see that this may lead to more amicable relations, more accommodation, less, and won't be a source of as much conflict.
Yeah, and the statistics among the younger people under 30 seem to indicate that it's definitely moving in that direction, and quickly.
Yeah.
I'd like to remind all of our viewers that you can send in questions in our chat room for Nancy, and I have a few questions already here for you. So we'll go right to those. From Marianne Herchett. See the movie A Day Without a Mexican, about how the California economy cannot run without the Mexican population here. I don't know if you've heard of that movie or not.
Yeah. The one, A Day Without Mexicans?
A Day Without a Mexican.
Yeah.
So we'll just put that out for the whole group. And then there's another question from Lynn Alicia Franco. How do you understand the resistance to legalizing the undocumented?
Well, that's a political issue.
Yeah.
Because one party is much more sympathetic to legislation to provide a method for a means of legalizing undocumented immigrants. I mean, this is a problem in the I think it's a political issue that whereas the Republican Party has made is against it. It's going to look at what any kind of legislation in Congress to make it possible for some immigrants to legalize their status has been opposed mostly by the Republican Party, and so it's going to be very hard with Democrats only having 50. They don't have enough votes because they would like to. The Democratic Party, by the way, it has a growing number of minorities, racial minorities are Democrats. I mean, it's quite 40, what is it? Racial minorities, according to a Pew survey, make up 40% of those who identify or lean toward the Democratic Party. And they have, the Democrats are responsive to that. They also, Democrats have a large numbers of supporters who are college educated and liberal, and that is different from the Republican Party, whose base and key supporters are non-college educated whites, conservative whites, and evangelical Protestants. And they are not and their leaders have made immigration and, anti-immigration an issue. And so they're not supporting that. I mean, after all, Donald Trump tried to do away with the DREAM Act. I mean, with the executive order that Obama passed for DACA. I mean, it didn't work because the courts didn't agree. But, that DACA, that's not legalization. That's just, several years in which you can work and not be deported.
Yeah.
The Democrats have supported much broader changes, including legalization. So I think it is a big issue in this country with 11 million undocumented, with a growing proportion of undocumented people here, really a settled population and without rights and a risk of deportation. So,
do you want to talk for a second about how we, before the Civil War, that there was the Know Nothing political party, which was much more direct and vicious about the same topic. So, but it had a different target.
Yeah, we have been there before. There have been nativist movements. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in 1882 to bar Chinese from coming to the country. So we have had a lot of anti-immigrant politicians and in their own parties, and we spoke about the legislation that was passed in 1924. I mean, that was targeted at Eastern and Southern Europeans to ban them, to stop immigration. So, we have definitely had that in the past. So I guess the optimistic part is that we've had that in the past, and yet those movements died out. So the question is, this is a question for the future, to what extent will there be changes? I mean, for example, many Republican politicians, this is an optimistic view, that will they feel, as there's a growing minority population, as they feel that they need to appeal to, will they change some of their positions? Will they change some of their positions? I don't, there's other pressures on them, but that could be one pressure that might lead at least some to change. I don't know. There's been no congressional legislation on immigration for a long time. I mean, George W. Bush tried to get, legislation and that would be favorable to undocumented immigration, and he didn't. And he didn't. The the right-wing Republicans wouldn't support it, and it didn't even come on. It didn't pass. That's the last. So most of the measure, the action at the national level has been through these administrative measures, through executive orders. That's been what's happening, and currently Biden is trying to undo many of the executive orders or administrative measures that Trump put in place including those that, for example, the public charge rule that has made it more difficult for low-income immigrants to come to the U.S. And that's being changed. There are changes being made that will open up the possibility for more legal immigration than had been possible, would be possible if Trump had been elected again.
Well, both the good news and the bad news about both political parties is that they've both been on different sides of this issue over their history. So they can always go back and say, let's do what Lincoln did, or they can go back and say, let's not do what the Democrats can say, let's do what the Southern Democrats did, until the 60s. And so people can move back and forth because each party has made serious mistakes in this way, serious mistakes from our discussion point of view about the immigration issue and the facts that are on the table. But the current time is that Lincoln's party is the one that's giving this the problem. And it was interesting that President Johnson, when he passed the Civil Rights Act, knew when he passed the Civil Rights Act that he was handing the South to the Republicans.
And of course, that was a big factor, obviously, in the realignment of the political parties. But immigration has also played a role.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that now that's such a big issue because it's always been, other than a few times, it's never been the big issue. The political parties had discussions about how they're going to approach foreign affairs or how they're going to approach, this big issue or how we're going to approach welfare, something like that, for the nation as a whole. But this issue gets a lot of play because the Republicans think that more immigrants means more votes for the Democrats, and the Democrats think more immigrants mean more votes for the Democrats. So, but that's not actually true. It's true on average, but it's not quite black and white as you were saying earlier.
No, well, we've seen that. We know that minorities tend to trend Democratic, and the most Democratic are African Americans. But about 2/3 or more of Hispanics and Asians have voted in the last 4 presidential elections, have voted for the Democrat. But interestingly, and there's been a lot written about how in 2020, Trump gained 10% of the Hispanic vote. So, the question is, is that will there be further defections among Hispanics to the Republicans? That we don't know, but that's an issue. I think that you were raising that.
Well, go back to what you said before. With history always going back and forth on it, you can't predict which way it's going to go. But even if we do something extremely stupid on this issue, we can have some hope that it will change again in the future because that's what's happened most of the time when we've gone too far or done something that was idiotic.
Well, I think that when we see immigration, just to that we don't know the exact numbers who will be allowed in terms of lawful permanent residents in the period from about 2000 to 2020, in most years, at least a million immigrant lawful permanent residents were admitted. So it may not be that high, but I think whoever is in power, I think the economic demands that we talked about in the demographic features of an aging population, low fertility, they're going to be pressures for anybody, for anybody in power to allow in a certain number of immigrants. So I think that we're going to see continued large-scale immigration for some time to come, and so they will continue to change America, right, and have an impact here.
And I have one last question from the audience from Bhavani Chandrasekhar. Immigrants will have to learn more languages. How will that affect the education of their children? Since we have not touched on the language issue, which has always been a big immigrant issue. Do they have to all learn English and all these, English only, over the past and stuff like that? And clearly, New York City's never been like that.
Well,
but the rest of the country.
Language, if I may say, language is and looking at the integration of immigrants. Social scientists often say America is the graveyard of languages. What's happening now is what's happened in the past. Immigrants coming as adults who speak another language, learn some English, but they're not fluent. And the children of immigrants are either bilingual, and sometimes they even lose the parental language. And by the third generation, the overwhelming number of grandchildren of immigrants are monolingual in English. They don't even know the immigrant language that their grandparents had. And the data show that happened in the past. It's happening today, in fact, even more quickly. And of course, the other issue is that a lot of immigrants come speaking English today.
Yeah.
I mean, they come from countries, the English-speaking Caribbean, for one. Many Indians come speaking English. And English is really the global language of business. So, I think that that English, there's a move towards English, basically, among immigrants and certainly their children and their grandchildren.
Yeah, and I think part of that, we talked about it before too, that immigrants are often self-selecting, more ambitious and everything, back in the countries they came from. In most countries in the world, if you are that kind of person, you'll be learning English most likely, even to get by in your own society at a certain level. As you said, because it's the international language of business. The French are mad that
Yes.
that their language was very close to the lingua franca of the world, but they missed out by 20 years because of the British Empire. But there we are.
Well, and I think that if you want to get ahead in the U.S., and you need English.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the immigrants will be an advantage. For example, Chinese immigrants, right? As other economy, that bilingualism, that if you know two languages,
Right.
English and another language, that may be helpful in the job market. But you do need English in the United States, and we see that. As I said, this is the linguistic assimilation happened in the past, and it's happening over the generations. That's how you have to really look at it. You can't just look at it as a person who came yesterday.
Yeah.
You can't expect, and I think one of the things that's happened is because we have constant replenishment of immigration, people see people, Americans see people who are foreign, right, among them who are speaking another language, but those people may have only just come a year ago.
Right.
But if you look at generations and you see how long people have lived in the United States, then you can see the change. I think people, when I used to give talks in New York, often people would tell me, "Oh, my grandparents, my great grandparents, they knew English when they come." This would be people who were descendants of Jewish or Italian immigrants,
Right.
and that really was not true. It often took a long time for their grandparents to learn English, but the children of it, as I said again, the children and grandchildren do learn English, and they speak it often, and they don't even speak the home country language. Spanish has more continuity because there are
Right.
so many Spanish speakers, but they also are bilingual
Right.
in the second generation, overwhelmingly.
Yeah. So of all the things to be afraid about immigration, which don't make sense, the language issue is yet another one because the facts are
Yeah,
totally
that's-
against it. All you have to do is wait a generation or two. So thank you very much, Nancy. That was a great, move through what happened from 65 on, plus the history
Oh my
before.
gosh.
Really appreciate it. Nancy Foner, the author of One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America. Thank you very much for joining us. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in now our 120th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.